March 1941. In a dim, echoing bay at Mare Island Naval Shipyard, Vallejo, a welding torch spat sparks that looked like tiny suns falling into shadow. Edward Ted Nelson squinted through his goggles, thumbed the stub of a pencil, and scrawled another angry line in a battered notebook. There has to be a better way. $11 a day didn't buy patience when you could see an avoidable waste of time with every swing of a wrench. Beneath the wooden deck of a submarine under construction, Nelson had watched a team of workmen spend a full shift to fasten a single run of planking. A forest of scaffolding filled the cramped voids under the deck where men crouched on narrow planks, arms extended upward, threading nuts onto bolts that had been driven down through countersunk holes. The choreography was precise. Measured drilling, exact countersinking, careful positioning, then the tedious assembly from below. But it was breathtakingly slow. In every compartment the same ritual repeated, and Ted could feel the clock of history ticking. The Pacific was darkening with tension, and American yards needed ships, not delays. Ted Nelson was not a theorist. At 36, he carried 15 years of hard machine shop experience across California, in calloused hands and a practical mind trained to notice how metal behaved under heat and stress. He had been employee number 3872 at Mare Island for some months, a day shift welder from 7 to 4, and he knew the yard's heartbeat. Founded in 1854 by David Glasgow Farragut as the Navy's first Pacific depot, Mare Island had sprawled along the Napa River to some 635 acres by early 1941 and already run 3 shifts when required. Submarine construction there had accelerated as the nation watched the Pacific with narrowing eyes. The yard employed roughly 12,000 civilians in early 1941, a workforce that would mushroom toward 50,000 by 1944. What maddened Nelson was not fatigue but avoidable waste. Wooden decks had reasons: better traction when wet, quieter footsteps, insulation from cold steel, and easier local repair in case of fire. Still, the attachment method used for decades, bolt from above, nut and washer below, demanded scaffolds that took days to assemble, crews working in cramped positions that broke backs and blurred knuckles, and an operation that measured progress in human hours, not minutes. On a submarine, a single installation could mean hundreds of attachment points. On carriers, tens of thousands of square feet of decking translated into an almost obscene tally of bolts and men. Ted's mind kept returning to a simpler idea. Eliminate the tedious below-deck threading. If studs could be attached from the top, if fasteners could be welded to the steel framework in place of bolts and inaccessible nutwork, then the whole scaffolding drama could vanish. One man working from above, welding a stud into a prepared hole, a threaded insert in the plank to receive it. Seconds instead of days. The notion was almost embarrassingly straightforward. Yet the devil lay in the details. Stud welding existed in limited contexts, on flat horizontal plates, where flux powder used to facilitate the weld could sit still under gravity. Any attempt to adapt that process to overhead or vertical surfaces produced failure. The flux spilled, the arc misbehaved, the welds were unreliable. For 20 years, engineers had wrestled with the problem. The answer that came to Ted, 1 hour after another in the torturous gloom under decks, was deceptively simple. Replace loose flux powder with a small encapsulation, a ceramic cap that held flux in place regardless of orientation. Attach the cap to the end of the stud. Design a hand tool with a spring-loaded plunger that pressed the stud against the steel. Trigger an electrical arc for an instant, and the stud would fuse solidly to the framework in less than a second. A disposable cap preserved the flux and permitted welding in every position. Overhead, vertical, tight corners. Threaded inserts in the wood would engage the studs and secure the plank from above. No scaffolding, no workers cramped below, no two crews coordinated across a thin layer of hull. He sketched the idea in that notebook with the kind of practical clarity born of years on shop floors. A pistol grip gun, a spring plunger to seat the stud, an electrical trigger, a magazine or quick load for studs, and, most important, the ceramic flux cap. The cap itself he refined through trial. Different clays, firing techniques, flux mixes, until one prototype held flux firmly, withstood heat, and fell away cleanly after welding. The concept was elegant. The arc would vaporize the cap and fuse metal to metal, leaving a strong, repeatable joint. When Nelson first took his crude drawings to Lieutenant Morrison, a Navy supervisor, the meeting lasted 5 minutes. Morrison thumbed through the paper, frowned, and said the two most fatal words for innovators in wartime yards: "We have procedures." The Navy, he added curtly, followed specifications. Deviation was not the job of a welder. Nelson persisted, knocking on the door of Hartwell, the chief welding engineer retained as a civilian. Hartwell was kinder in tone but equally immovable. "Son, if it were that easy, someone would have done it. You're proposing a change that will have to go to the Bureau of Ships in Washington. Engineering studies, testing, approvals. That process takes months, usually years." Ted blurted practicalities. "We don't have years. We need boats now." Hartwell shrugged. "Not my call." Undeterred, Nelson followed the yard's suggestion box and wrote a formal letter to Captain Thomas Withers, the shipyard commander. He framed the problem clearly, outlined the stud weld cap idea, and included conservative time and cost estimates for the yard if it adopted the method. Weeks passed. The reply arrived on official letterhead: "Appreciation for his initiative." A notice that all technical suggestions were forwarded to the Bureau of Ships Engineering Review Board, and an estimate that the review might take 18 to 24 months. The formality stung. It felt like bureaucratic polite indifference when minutes mattered. Nelson crumpled the letter and set his jaw. That night, he made a choice. If the Navy bureaucracy would not act with the speed the country needed, he would build a working prototype himself and prove the method. He cleared the garage behind his small Vallejo bungalow and began collecting scrap steel, spent welding rods, and bits of ceramic from a pottery supply a neighbor kept. His wife Emma watched with a mixture of concern and weary trust. "Ted, you'll get fired," she warned. "They won't like a welder tinkering with Navy work." He smiled without humor. "They'll like it when they see submarines in the water faster." That's what matters. Working evenings and weekends, he fashion-built a pistol-grip stud welder, a handpiece with a spring plunger that held studs in place, an electrical feed from a small transformer salvaged from a defunct freighter, and a magazine that let him slot studs one after another. The first cap designs cracked. Some flux formulations burned too violently. Others failed to produce a solid metallurgical bond. He kept sketches, measurements, and notes like a man recording a journal of survival rather than invention. Cap material lasted 20 welds before shattering. Cap B needed a higher melt point. Flux C produced cold welds at lower currents. In the small hours, Ted learned what welding theory taught in colleges: arc time, contact pressure, current density, and the delicate balance between heat and material properties. He adapted and readapted. At first, the prototype would make noisy, ugly welds, proud studs that would snap off under stress. Then he altered the plunger spring rate. Then he doped the flux mix with a trace of manganese. Then, finally, a run of 6 studs in a steel plate held firm under a hammer without loosening. The first time one of his studs took a load, and the threaded insert in a wood block spun down onto it smoothly. He sat on a milk crate and laughed out loud like a man who'd found a key. Word travels quickly on shipyard streets. A couple of co-workers saw his crude prototype and the demonstration, a dozen studs placed in under a minute, and the reaction was immediate. Envy, disbelief, hope. Nelson was careful. He knew what had happened at the meetings with officials, yet he could not keep the secret. He invited Hartwell to the garage one Saturday, hands greasy and eyes bright, and did the simplest demonstration he could manage. 1 stud, 1 weld, 1 plank secured in seconds. Hartwell watched the stud hold under a strap wrench, and then looked at the welded cap residue and the neat thread. Hartwell was silent for a long time. He asked practical questions about repeatability, fatigue life, corrosion under sea environment, and how the process would be standardized. Ted answered in the blunt, experience-honed language of a shop. You can make the cap from alumina. The flux mix keeps clean under salt spray. We can build tooling to control current and plunger travel. It was not an engineer's paper, but it was a craftsman's proof. Still, the path to change remained bureaucracy-laden. The Bureau of Ships demanded formal testing and documented procedures. The Navy's insistence on specifications was not mere red tape, but a discipline born of safety and uniformity. Yet the seed had been planted. Nelson had moved an idea from the dark underdeck complaints of a welder to the careful scrutiny of the yard's technical staff. What he did not yet realize, and what his superiors could not yet foresee, was the scale of the savings the method would unlock. Later calculations would credit stud welding with saving tens of millions of man-hours across the war shipbuilding program, and fundamentally altering how navies joined wood to steel. On a foggy morning a month later, as Ted walked back through the gate toward his shift, the garage key in his pocket felt heavier with possibility than a threat. He had turned private frustration into public invention. The stakes were no longer just about saving his aching back or getting paid $11 a day. They were about moving production at a national scale, about shortening the gap between shipyard and sea at a moment when every hour could matter. He had built a prototype. He had a working flux cap. And most importantly, he had proved that the machinery of small mines and old procedures could be challenged by the cunning of experience. The Navy bureaucracy could still insist on its 18 to 24-month review. They could send forms and committees and insist on pounds of paper before accepting a shop floor truth. But in workshops and garages across Mare Island, the first dent had been made in a century of accepted practice. And Ted Nelson, who had only wanted a better way to do a miserable job, was about to discover how fast a single idea could travel once it had been shown to work. By late spring of 1941, after dozens of long evenings in his Vallejo garage, Ted Nelson finally had what he'd been chasing for months: a ceramic cap that worked. It gripped the flux securely, ignited the welding arc instantly, and could be made in quantity without breaking the bank. His tests became a nightly ritual: scrap steel plates clamped to sawhorses, sparks dancing against the walls. He turned the gun at every angle, flat, vertical, upside down, and every time the stud fused perfectly. Each weld took less than a heartbeat. 1 second, one flawless bond, stronger than a through bolt, faster than any method the Navy had ever used, and all from the top side, no more crawling under decks. The simplicity of it felt revolutionary. When Ted brought the prototype to work, He couldn't resist showing a few trusted welders during lunch. They watched in awe as he pulled the trigger, a single stud locking into steel with a crisp flash. "This'll save us weeks on every sub," one said, eyes wide. Another slapped him on the shoulder. "Show Morrison again. He's got to listen this time." Ted just shook his head. He's already made up his mind. A third worker smirked. "Then to hell with the Navy. Quit and sell it yourself. Every shipyard from here to Seattle will be lining up." At first, Ted laughed it off. He was a welder, not a salesman. No investors, no office, no clue about business. But that night, as he wiped his hands clean and looked at the little gun on his bench, the words kept echoing. Sell it yourself. Maybe that was the only way forward. He began to imagine it. Shipyards everywhere racing to meet deadlines, desperate for speed. The Kaiser yards in Richmond were booming. Bethlehem Steel's docks in San Francisco were expanding. Every facility faced the same bottleneck that he'd already solved. So, on June 20th, 1941, Ted Nelson walked into the personnel office at Mare Island and handed in his resignation. His supervisor stared at him in disbelief. "Nelson, you've got a steady job and a family to feed. Don't throw it away chasing a wild idea." Ted smiled faintly. "I'm not chasing anything. I've already caught it." He glanced back toward the submarine bay, his world for 15 years, then turned and walked out, leaving behind an 11-a-day paycheck, a desk full of blueprints, and a mind full of conviction. With his savings barely enough for a month's rent, Ted decided to make the leap official. On July 1st, 1941, he founded Nelson Specialty Welding Equipment Corporation. To finance production, he secured a $95,000 loan from the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, a Depression-era program meant to help small businesses. With that, he rented a modest workshop in Vallejo and started hand-building stud welding guns and flux-capped studs with a team of 2. The first few months were brutal. He cold-called machine shops, shipyards, and steel fabricators. Most didn't even take his calls. Those who did were skeptical. "Sounds good, but we'll stick to bolts for now." Still, a few brave foremen agreed to see a demo. Ted showed up with a dented toolbox, fired the gun, and welded a perfect stud in under a second. Slowly, orders trickled in. One gun here, a small batch of studs there. By September 1941, Nelson had sold just 18 welding guns and a few thousand studs. It wasn't much, but it was proof that people were listening. Then came December 7th, 1941, the day that would shatter the old world. Pearl Harbor, 8 battleships crippled, nearly 200 aircraft destroyed, and over 2,000 Americans dead. The country awoke in anger. Overnight, the quiet yards of America became engines of war. Within days, the shipbuilding industry went into overdrive. The Kaiser yards began turning out Liberty ships like an assembly line. Mare Island received emergency submarine orders. Bethlehem Steel switched to 3 shifts, 24 hours a day. But everyone faced the same nightmare Ted had once fought, building faster than ever before, with methods that were too slow to win a war. And then the phone rang. Purchasing agents who had dismissed him months ago were suddenly desperate. Kaiser ordered 50 welding guns and 10,000 studs. Bethlehem Steel followed with 40 guns. Even Mare Island, the very yard that had ignored him, placed an order for 60 guns and 20,000 studs. Morrison, his old supervisor, signed the purchase order himself. There was no apology attached, just a stamped requisition and a note, urgent delivery required. By January 1942, Nelson's tiny workshop couldn't breathe under the flood of orders. He needed a real factory. He leased a larger building in San Leandro, a quiet stretch of farmland south of Oakland. It wasn't much to look at, a corrugated shed surrounded by cornfields, but it had power, floor space, and the promise of growth. By March, he had 20 employees. By June, 50. By September, 150. The shop buzzed day and night, 7 days a week. 30 stud welding guns rolled off the line every day, along with thousands of ceramic-capped studs. Reports from the field were astonishing. Deck work that once demanded 12 men for 6 days now took 3 men in a single shift. The elimination of scaffolding alone saved 2 more days per vessel. Welds were stronger than bolts, cleaner, and easier to replace. At Mare Island, where Ted's journey had begun, construction time for submarines started dropping month by month. Between 1941 and 1945, the yard completed 17 submarines, each one faster than the last. By mid-1942, stud welding wasn't just for deck planking anymore. It was being used for everything. Pipe hangers, electrical mounts, bulkhead attachments. Anywhere, metal met metal. The Navy's Bureau of Ships, which had once buried Ted's proposal under paperwork, now ordered full-scale testing. Their engineers studied weld strength, stress resistance, and corrosion under salt exposure. The verdict came back clear. Nelson's welds weren't just faster, they were stronger. On November 19, 1942, less than a year after Pearl Harbor, a Navy sedan rolled up to Nelson's San Leandro plant. Out stepped 5 men in full uniform. Captain William Harrison of the Bureau of Ships did the talking. "Mr. Nelson," he said formally, "the Navy's testing division has completed its evaluation of your process. Our findings show your stud welding system has already saved the United States Navy over 5 million man-hours in construction during the past 10 months. That number is expected to rise sharply as more shipyards adopt it." He paused, then added, "By order of the Secretary of the Navy, I am authorized to present you with a citation for outstanding contribution to the war effort." Ted stood silent, the words sinking in. The same institution that had dismissed him now stood in his factory, offering gratitude, pride mixed with disbelief. Captain Harrison seemed to read his thoughts. "I've reviewed your original submission to Mare Island," he said. "It should have been approved. That was an error, and on behalf of the Navy, I apologize. But your persistence outside official channels allowed this technology to reach our fleet far sooner than bureaucracy ever could. Sometimes, Mr. Nelson, the best service to your country is refusing to wait for permission." Ted accepted the citation quietly. It wasn't triumph that filled him, it was vindication. He'd been right, but it had taken risk, stubbornness, and a garage full of sparks to prove it. As the war effort accelerated, so did Nelson's company. In March 1943, he opened a second factory in Camden, New Jersey, to serve the East Coast shipyards. Philadelphia, Norfolk, and Charleston among them. By mid-1943, Nelson Specialty Welding Equipment Corporation employed over 400 men and women. Annual revenue topped $4 million, though Ted still lived modestly. Khaki work pants, a brown shirt, and long days on the factory floor. Most of the profits went straight back into production, tooling, and new equipment. The Navy's early estimate of 5 million man-hours saved was already obsolete. By 1943, stud welding was standard across every major naval construction site in America. Aircraft carriers of the Essex class used tens of thousands of Nelson studs to fasten their flight decks and interior mounts. 24 of those carriers would serve during the war. The massive Iowa-class battleships, symbols of American sea power, used the same process for decking, armor mounting, and machinery supports. Baltimore-class cruisers, destroyers, and landing craft all followed suit. But the biggest transformation came in submarine construction. At Mare Island, Nelson's old workplace, stud welding had become the yard's quiet miracle. A process that shaved days, then weeks off production. It helped transform the facility into one of the Navy's most efficient builders. Across the country, Portsmouth Naval Shipyard in New Hampshire pushed the technique even further. Between 1940 and 1945, Portsmouth launched 79 submarines, a record unmatched in naval history. On January 27, 1944, the yard set an all-time record: 4 submarines launched in a single day: Redfish, Ronquil, Razorback, and Scabbardfish. The following year, Portsmouth averaged a completed submarine every 11 days. From the Great Lakes to the Atlantic coast, shipyards armed with Nelson's invention built faster than any fleet before them. Even the Inland Manitowoc Shipbuilding Company in Wisconsin produced 28 submarines, each floated down rivers to the Gulf for duty in the Pacific. Ted Nelson had started as an ignored welder with an idea in a notebook. By 1943, that idea had become a cornerstone of America's industrial might. One spark at a time. Across the shipyards of America, the scale of production defied imagination. During World War II, the United States built 203 submarines, each one requiring thousands of stud-welded attachments. Every stud saved minutes of labor, minutes that multiplied across thousands of fittings, hundreds of submarines, and countless shipyards. The result was staggering. Entire weeks of construction time vanished from every vessel. But submarines were only part of the story. The true volume of wartime production came from the Liberty Ship program, the backbone of the Allied supply line. Managed by the Maritime Commission and built primarily in Kaiser's legendary West Coast yards, 2,110 Liberty ships were produced during the war. Each ship contained between 5,000 and 8,000 stud-welded attachments, used for deck planking, cargo equipment, gun mounts, and ship fittings. Then came the Victory ships, faster, larger, and more advanced successors to the Liberty design. Their production pushed American industry into overdrive. By 1943, shipyards were launching 3 new ships every single day, 75 per month, 900 per year, a level of output unmatched in human history. This was only possible through radical innovation, prefabrication, modular assembly, and specialized tools that transformed shipbuilding from a craft into an industrial science. Among those tools, Ted Nelson's stud welding gun was a quiet but crucial part of the revolution. By eliminating scaffolding and reducing attachment times, it allowed workers to move faster, safer, and with fewer hands. And despite the frantic pace, the welds were strong enough to endure the North Atlantic's worst storms and enemy fire alike. By the spring of 1943, the U.S. Navy officially recognized Nelson's contribution. On May 11, 1943, the Secretary of the Navy presented the Nelson Specialty Welding Equipment Corporation with the Army-Navy E Award for Excellence in Production. This prestigious award, created in 1942, honored only the top 5% of wartime manufacturers, those whose quality and output directly strengthened the war effort. Each winning company received a flag pennant for its factory and special pins for every worker. The ceremony at Nelson's San Leandro plant was unforgettable. Navy officers, Army representatives, and local officials stood before the workers who had powered the wartime miracle. Each employee received a pin of recognition. When Ted Nelson stepped forward, still in his shop clothes, he spoke simply. "We didn't do this for awards or recognition. We did this because our country needed it. Every stud we make, every gun we build, helps bring our sailors and soldiers home safely. That's all the reward we need." But the honors didn't stop there. Companies that maintained outstanding performance for 6 months after receiving the initial E award earned a star to add to their pennant. Nelson's company earned its first star in November 1943, and a second in May 1944, one of only a handful of firms in America to reach that level of distinction. By the end of the war, the Nelson Corporation's impact was measurable on a national scale. Official citations credited the company with saving an estimated 50 million man-hours in naval construction. 50 million hours, the equivalent of 5,700 years of labor, all saved by a single innovation: a spring-loaded welding gun and a ceramic flux cap. Those hours weren't just numbers. They meant more ships in the water, more submarines on patrol, more carriers launching aircraft, and more landing craft delivering troops. Each ship completed faster translated into lives saved and battles won. The innovation also helped solve another challenge: the wartime labor shortage. Stud welding required less skill than traditional bolting or arc welding, meaning new workers could learn the process quickly and perform it safely. As the war dragged on, women entered shipyards in record numbers. Rosie the Riveter became the national symbol, but alongside her were thousands of Wendy the Welders. Women mastered stud welding, installed deck planking, and fitted ships at a pace that shocked the old-timers. At its wartime peak, Mare Island Naval Shipyard employed nearly 50,000 workers, including 9,000 women. The Kaiser yards employed hundreds of thousands more, nearly 30% women, all using tools and methods designed for speed, safety, and simplicity. By 1944, the tide of war had turned decisively. The industrial power of the United States had crushed the Axis advantage. America was now building more ships, planes, tanks, and guns than Germany and Japan combined. What President Roosevelt proudly called the arsenal of democracy. And at the heart of that arsenal, in every shipyard across the country, was Ted Nelson's quiet revolution. A small device that transformed sparks into strength and innovation into victory. When the guns of World War II finally fell silent, America shifted its energy from destruction to creation. The same industrial power that had built battleships and bombers now turned toward building highways, bridges, skyscrapers, and suburbs. Everywhere steel was being cut, welded, and raised skyward. And every one of those projects needed faster, stronger ways to join metal. By 1948, Nelson's company had made the transition to peacetime production. The frantic wartime pace was gone, but stability had replaced urgency. The firm shrank in size but grew in innovation, developing new stud designs, improved welding guns, and specialized applications for the booming construction and automotive industries. Nelson's small wartime miracle had become a cornerstone of peacetime progress. In 1950, Ted Nelson made a life-changing decision. He sold his company to TRW, one of America's largest industrial conglomerates. The sale gave him financial security and allowed him to step back from daily management. But the Nelson name remained proudly on every product. TRW continued to produce and market Nelson stud welding equipment, honoring the legacy of its founder. Over the following decades, the company would change hands several times. TRW sold it to Farsantech Incorporated in 2000, which was later acquired by Doncaster's Group Limited in 2007. Then, in 2018, Stanley Black & Decker, one of the most recognized names in tools, purchased the industrial division. Through all these transitions, one thing endured: the Nelson brand. Today, under Stanley Engineered Fastening, Nelson's stud welding technology is still manufactured and marketed globally. More than 80 years later, the essential principle Ted Nelson invented in his Vallejo garage remains unchanged. Modern stud welding systems now use inverter power supplies for precision control, automated feed systems for mass production, and robotic arms in car factories that can place and weld hundreds of studs per minute. Yet, at its core, the process is the same. A stud, a ceramic flux cap, a spring-loaded gun, and an electric arc. 1 second per weld. No scaffolding. No wasted motion. The applications have expanded far beyond naval shipbuilding. Construction workers use stud welding to secure metal decking to the steel skeletons of skyscrapers. Bridge builders rely on it for guardrails and lighting mounts. Nuclear power plants use it to attach cable trays and equipment supports. In automotive factories, stud welding is used throughout vehicle bodies for grounding points and trim attachment. What began as a naval necessity became a universal industrial tool. But perhaps the most moving legacy of Nelson's invention lies not in new construction, but in preserving the past. The battleship USS Texas, one of only 7 surviving warships to serve in both World Wars, is undergoing restoration today. Its corroded hull plates and deteriorated fittings are being repaired with modern Nelson stud welding equipment. The same technology that helped win the war now helps preserve its history. In San Francisco, the submarine USS Pampanito, a World War II veteran now serving as a floating museum, uses Nelson's equipment for ongoing maintenance. The boat welcomes more than 100,000 visitors a year at the Embarcadero, and keeping her safe requires constant, careful work. Thanks to Nelson's process, volunteers, not all of them certified welders, can repair and maintain the vessel efficiently and safely. Ted Nelson lived long enough to see the reach of his invention. He saw stud welding become standard practice worldwide, saw industries he'd never imagined adopt his methods, and watched his own name become synonymous with a welding process used on every continent. He died in 1994, at the age of 89, having witnessed the end of the Cold War and the dawn of the digital age, a world profoundly shaped by the generation that had fought and rebuilt it. His achievements can be measured in numbers: 50 million man-hours saved, 2 Army-Navy E awards, thousands of ships built faster, and billions of studs manufactured. But numbers only tell part of the story. Behind those statistics were sailors who came home alive because their submarine was completed in time to join the fleet. Marines who landed safely because landing craft were built and ready. Families spared grief because the war ended sooner. The true measure of innovation isn't just efficiency, it's lives preserved. Ted Nelson, the 11-a-day welder who was told his idea was impractical, saved more lives than many combat heroes. His weapon wasn't a gun. It was a tool of creation. His battlefield wasn't the ocean or the skies, but the shipyards and factories of America. History is filled with innovators who were told they were wrong. Wilbur and Orville Wright were dismissed as dreamers who believed men could fly. Henry Ford was mocked for thinking cars could be built for the common man. Chester Carlson, the inventor of xerography, was rejected by 24 companies before one finally saw the potential of what became the photocopier. What made Ted Nelson different was his quiet persistence. He didn't argue with bureaucrats or lobby officials. He simply quit his job, risked his savings, and proved his idea worked. Then the results did the talking. That's the essence of the American spirit of innovation. Not waiting for permission, not fearing failure, not accepting that things must always be done the same way. It's the courage to see a problem, design a better way, and act on it, no matter how small or humble the beginning. The Mare Island Naval Shipyard, where Nelson's idea was first rejected, closed in 1996 after 142 years of service. In its lifetime, it built 512 ships and repaired thousands more, including 44 submarines, the last being the nuclear-powered USS Drum, launched in 1970. Today, the site has been reborn as a mix of commercial and residential spaces. Many of the historic buildings still stand. The chapel, the dry docks, the towering cranes. Visitors walking through the preserved sections can almost hear the echoes of the war years. The pounding of hammers, the hiss of welders, the hum of a nation working without rest. Inside Building 46, once a busy pipe shop, a small museum displays tools, photographs, and artifacts from the shipyard's history. Among them are wrenches, rivet guns, and old Navy blueprints. But there is no monument to Ted Nelson. No plaque honoring the man whose idea saved 50 million hours of labor. And that's probably how he would have wanted it. Nelson was never chasing fame. He was chasing solutions. His reward wasn't recognition. It was results. His satisfaction came from watching things work better, faster, safer. But his story carries a timeless lesson. Innovation often comes from unexpected places, not from universities or corporate labs, but from people who work with their hands and see inefficiencies up close. The next world-changing idea might come from a welder in a shipyard, a mechanic in a garage, a nurse in a hospital, or a teacher in a classroom. Often, these are the very people experts dismiss as unqualified. History tells us to listen to them, not because every idea will succeed, but because the few that do can change everything. Ted Nelson's invention, a small ceramic flux cap and a spring-loaded welding gun, eliminated scaffolding, saved weeks of labor, improved safety, and accelerated ship production when it mattered most. 50 million man-hours saved. That's 5,700 years of human labor, enough to fill entire lifetimes. And those numbers don't even measure the ripple effects. The ships launched sooner, the morale boosted by exceeding production goals, the deterrent effect of a fleet that grew faster than any enemy could match. Nelson's idea didn't just save time, it reshaped the balance of power. America's victory in World War II depended on courage in combat, but it also depended on innovation in industry. Soldiers and sailors won the battles, but welders, engineers, and builders won the war. That's the deeper truth of Nelson's legacy. He represents the power of practical genius, the kind that lives not in laboratories, but in workshops, garages, and factory floors. As we face the great challenges of the 21st century, from climate change to infrastructure decay, the same spirit is needed again. Solutions will come not only from high-tech research labs, but from ordinary people who see problems clearly and refuse to ignore them. The next Ted Nelson might be designing a better solar panel in a garage. The next revolution in efficiency might come from a factory worker who knows exactly where time and energy are being wasted. The next great idea might already be dismissed by experts who know better. That's why we must lower the barriers between problem and solution, between idea and implementation. History shows that progress often comes from those who work outside the system, precisely because the system wasn't ready to change. Ted Nelson began as a welder making $11 a day. He ended as a millionaire industrialist whose invention helped his country win a world war. But he never stopped seeing himself as a mechanic with a simple mission: make things work better. In his later years, when asked about his success, he simply said, "I just made a better mousetrap. The world beat a path to my door." He didn't call it genius, just common sense, applied with courage and persistence. And that's his true legacy. Not the awards, not the company, not even the millions of hours saved. It's the enduring proof that one person with one good idea and the will to pursue it can change history. Every time a welder today pulls the trigger on a stud welding gun, every time a bridge goes up faster or a ship is built stronger, every time someone looks at a problem and says, "There has to be a better way," Ted Nelson's spirit lives on. He asked that question in 1941, and his answer helped win a war. The next great breakthrough will come from someone who dares to do the same. Because the most important innovations don't come from following procedures. They come from the courage to ignore the experts, trust your own observation, and build the solution you know will work. Ted Nelson did that. And 80 years later, the sparks from his invention are still lighting up the world.